Welcome to Breaking the Debt Cycle, Gaining Your Financial Freedom from Credit Cards.
Hello and welcome to Breaking the Debt Cycle, Gaining Your Financial Freedom from Credit Cards with experienced bankruptcy attorney Michael Sheridan. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and in today's episode, we are going to talk about Chapter 13 bankruptcy. If you've been considering bankruptcy, not sure if Chapter 13 is right for you, you are in the right place. Michael, great to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
All right, last time was all about Chapter 7. Now we're moving on to Chapter 13. So can you talk about what Chapter 13 bankruptcy is and how it differs from what we talked about in the last episode with Chapter 7?
Yeah, so Chapter 13 differs from Chapter 7 in a couple important aspects. The first is the format of the law and how it works. So in a Chapter 13, what you are doing is you are setting up a payment plan for your debt. And it can be both the unsecured debt and your secured debt. And I'll get more into that in a moment, but that's a powerful tool in Chapter 13. And so there's a number of reasons why sometimes people file for Chapter 13 or choose Chapter 13 over Chapter 7. For a lot of people, it's because they don't meet the qualifications, the income qualifications for Chapter 7. And for some other people, it's to stop things like, hey, I've got a foreclosure pending. I worked out an arrangement with my mortgage company. And, a lot of people after the pandemic were coming into my office and were like, well, hey, I lost my job and I worked out something with my mortgage lender. They say I don't have to pay for 6 months. And so when the end of the 6 months comes, I'll just pick up my payments. And I have to say, ooh, hold on. That's not what a forbearance is. Mm-hmm. A forbearance is the mortgage lender is forbearing their legal right to move forward the foreclosure while you're in default. And so they're forbearing that right for 6 months. But after that 6 months ends, you don't just pick up your monthly payments. They expect all 6 months to be paid at the end of the 6 month forbearance period.
Yeah.
And people are like, whoa, they didn't explain that to me. And like, well, that's they rarely do. But if you found yourself in that situation, you're like, I don't have 6 months of mortgage payments sitting in my bank account right now. You could actually use a Chapter 13 and say, hey, I'm going to use the automatic stay protection to prevent any kind of foreclosure going forward. And I'm going to take that chunk that I'm behind and I'm going to pay it over the next 3 to 5 years, depending what you qualify for. And when you come out the other side of the Chapter 13, you're now caught up on your mortgage. And of course, you're making your monthly payment, your mortgage payment as each month comes due, but then you're also putting a chunk towards paying off that amount that you're behind. And so you can use a Chapter 13 to prevent a foreclosure that way. And so that's a really powerful tool for people who are, found themselves temporarily unemployed or something happened, fell behind, and I got to keep my house, but I've got this foreclosure sale pending. What's extremely important, though, to understand is you have to file your Chapter 13 before the date of the foreclosure sale, also sometimes called a sheriff sale. Now, in Minnesota, we do have a 6 month redemption period. So by law, if a foreclosure sale happens on your home, you have the legal right to spend another 6 months in the home while you attempt to redeem the mortgage. And that's essentially finding some separate financer to pay off the entire mortgage balance to redeem the mortgage. Now that rarely happens, but you do have that 6 month period in the house to kind of figure out what your next move is. Now, if the foreclosure sale has happened and you're in your 6 month redemption period, we cannot use the Chapter 13 laws to undo the foreclosure. We can only use the Chapter 13 laws to stop a foreclosure that's about to happen in the future. And so, if you're looking at a foreclosure, you want to call my office sooner rather than later. Don't call me the Friday afternoon before your Monday morning foreclosure and say, I need to file Chapter 13. Let's come in a few weeks earlier and make sure we get all our ducks lined up and do it the right way. So Chapter 13 is very useful for that. Another thing that can be done through a Chapter 13 payment plan is you can actually change the terms, so to speak, of some of your secured debt. So, for example, your car loan, you can do what's called a cram down on a car loan. Now, there are certain requirements that the car loan has to meet. You have to have had the car loan for at least 910 days prior to the date that your Chapter 13 is filed, and your car has to be underwater. That means the value of the vehicle is less than the balance you owe against it. And if you meet those criteria, then you can basically pay the value of the car through the Chapter 13 payment plan and cram down the amount of the loan to be whatever the value of the vehicle is. And then we treat the remaining balance as an unsecured debt. And they get, just a percentage, a pro rata share of whatever else might be coming into the Chapter 13 plan. So that's a really powerful tool for people too. And another reason why people will sometimes choose Chapter 13 over Chapter 7.
That was going to be my next question. I'm curious, obviously a big one would be you don't qualify for Chapter 7. But if someone did qualify for Chapter 7, what are some of the reasons that they might choose Chapter 13 other than what you've just talked about?
Yeah. So besides foreclosure or a really burdensome car loan that you really wanted to keep the vehicle, taxes are another way that people use Chapter 13. So I have had a number of clients throughout the years where, for whatever reason, they're self-employed, times were tough, and they just couldn't afford to pay their taxes. And, that lasted a few years. And now with penalties and interest, the tax amount is just extraordinarily high. The IRS won't work with them. They're making all kinds of demands. You can use the Chapter 13 laws to basically stop the penalties and interest from accruing and say, hey, I'm going to pay off this tax debt over the next 3 to 5 years. And when I come out the other side, I no longer have any tax debt. I don't have the penalties and interest. And you might think, well, what's the point? If you got to pay the taxes, then what's the point of the Chapter 13? Well, in Chapter 13, there is a hierarchy assigned to your creditors. And at the top of this hierarchy are what we call priority debts. Priority debts are certain income taxes that are non-dischargeable. So income taxes actually can be discharged through a bankruptcy, either a Chapter 7 or a Chapter 13, but they have to meet certain criteria. And those criteria are, they have to be at least 3 years old. You have to have filed the tax returns at least 2 years prior to your bankruptcy filing. There cannot be any assessments against you in the 260 days prior to your bankruptcy filing. And that's an internal collection thing the IRS typically does. And there's no liens against you. Now, each of these factors, I could go into much more depth about them, but just for purposes of our conversation here, I'm just going to touch on them. If the income tax debt does not meet all 4 of those criteria, then it's deemed to be a priority tax debt. If all of your tax debt is priority, well, then when you file your case, the automatic stay prevents any future penalties and interest from accruing. So you can pay off the taxes and really pay down the principal and pay it off a lot quicker than if you were just working out a monthly payment plan through the IRS and the penalties and interest continue to accrue even while you're making your monthly payments to the IRS. So you're giving yourself, you're able to more rapidly pay down the principal. Now, what's also very common is if you've got tax debt that spans a few years, some of your taxes are actually going to meet the dischargeability criteria. And so those taxes are treated pretty much like credit card debt. And they are put into a pool at the bottom of the hierarchy called general unsecured creditors. And the general unsecured creditors just get what's left over after the other creditors in the hierarchy are addressed. And so they usually get a pro rata amount of whatever, pool of money is going to them. Now, I've got clients where no money goes to the general unsecured creditors. There's a few different things we look at to determine what your Chapter 13 payment would be each month. And it really starts with a simple formula. A, monthly net income minus B, monthly expenses equals C, your Chapter 13 payment. So the idea is whatever you're paying into your Chapter 13 should fit within your monthly budget, so that you and your family can address your living expenses. Now, there's guardrails on your expenses. You can't claim $600 a month for massages or, hey, my Learjet needs fuel, things like that. But it's pretty reasonable. Nobody's like going through your bank statement saying, hey, how often do you eat at McDonald's? Or, what kind of grocery store are you going to shop at? Nobody's micromanaging your budget, but there's kind of guardrails over, okay, is this in line with what we consider reasonable for your household size? And as long as you're meeting those criteria and you're accurately disclosing your income, then you pay what you can afford to pay. Now, once we get to that point, then there's other criteria we got to look at as well. But the overarching goal in a Chapter 13 is to make sure that you can use your income to pay your necessary and reasonable living expenses. But the court says you make a little bit more, so we want you to pay what you can to your creditors for a period of 3 to 5 years. But when you come out the other side, you're going to be happy that you took the time to meet with somebody who could put you into this payment plan, because when you come out the other side, you're going to have no tax debt. You're going to be debt free, except for, if you kept your mortgage and car loans and things like that, and be in a much better spot than you were than when you started.
What about as far as expenses? What about things like streaming services, or even like down to like your kids' extracurricular activities? Does that count? Can you take that out? Or yeah?
Yep, absolutely. Every day. I mean, whatever normal monthly expenses we all have, electric, heat, cable or streaming, internet, cell phone, food. And, the court official who kind of oversees this and does the due diligence, the trustee, they have to be realistic too. They're not interested in making people. We actually have a court decision in Minnesota that says, people don't have to live hand to mouth in Chapter 13.
Right.
But you also shouldn't be living on a steak and lobster budget, right? So, I mean, and by the time people come in to meet with me, they've already been doing quite a bit of belt tightening because they've been trying to pay on these debts and they want to try to avoid bankruptcy. But, at some point, you just can't make it work. And so that's why this body of law is here. And a lot of people are surprised to be like, wow, those are the standards. I never spend that much on clothing or personal care or recreation, But the court says, hey, we realize that, you can't live this extraordinarily low budget on your living expenses for a period of 3 to 5 years. It's just not going to be realistic or worth it for people. So, there's some cushion in there. But at the same time, you can't just say, well, massages and only the best for me.
Yeah. High end all the way. Yep. I'm fancy like that. What happens to assets and property during Chapter 13? Is it different from how what we discussed in our Chapter 7 episode?
Yeah. So we still do the same asset analysis in a Chapter 13, but the format of the Chapter 13 is really focused on your income and expenses. So whereas the format of the Chapter 7 is what are your assets and do you have adequate protection for all of them? The format in Chapter 13 is what is your income and what are your monthly expenses? Now, that being said, one of the things we look at after we look at that primary formula, monthly net income minus monthly expenses equal Chapter 13 payment, after we look at that, we then address what is called the best interest test. And the best interest test says, hypothetically, had you filed for Chapter 7, whatever your creditors, unsecured creditors, through an hypothetical Chapter 7 would have received from your unprotected assets, whatever that amount was, in a Chapter 13, your unsecured creditors have to at least receive that same amount. So we still look at the assets and what would be deemed unprotected in a Chapter 7, and we have to make sure that we're meeting that floor that best interest test sets up for us. And so, again, the asset protection laws are quite generous. So usually if there are unprotected assets, they're not a huge amount, and we can pretty easily meet that number, that floor that the best interest test sets for us. But you're not at risk of losing any assets in a Chapter 13, but we still do that asset analysis to make sure we're meeting that best interest test requirement from the court.
Okay. When it comes to the automatic stay, we talked about that in Chapter 7. How does it implemented in Chapter 13, and what does it protect the filer from? Yeah,
so same thing. Automatic stay in Chapter 13 is the exact same as it is in Chapter 7. And it's a really powerful tool because, again, as we talked about before, nobody really desires to file for bankruptcy. Nobody's like, yay, the day has finally come. I'm going to file for bankruptcy. And so people try to avoid it as much as possible. And that's absolutely understandable. But I think sometimes people just make a lot of assumptions about what bankruptcy is and maybe go a lot longer than maybe they should have gone before they talk to someone like me to learn what these benefits are and what the pros and cons of it are. And so if you find yourself in a position where you're starting to get sued by your creditors or you're getting garnished by your creditors, you definitely need to come in and talk to us, because that automatic stay is going to stop those creditors from taking a 25% bite of your paycheck. And if you think things are tight now, when you're only operating on 75% of your income, things are going to be really tight then.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Again, Congress understands we want to prioritize people being able to take care of their households. So that automatic stay on the date your case is filed, that garnishment is done. And it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, that's real powerful. If anyone listening who's like, all right, I need to talk about bankruptcy, I want to, but I want to kind of get an idea of what's ahead of me, whether it's chapter 7, chapter 13. What kind of things do you recommend people look at in their own financial picture in order to figure out what's next, the best next step?
Right. So there's a few things that I would say if you find yourself doing some of these things, it's really time to pick up the phone or go to our website and schedule a consultation with us. Consultations are absolutely free. There's no obligation, and you can learn about, what the benefits are and where you can find yourself if you go through this process. Things like if you're using credit cards to pay other credit cards, robbing Peter to pay Paul, that's a huge red flag. You should not be using one debt to pay off another debt. It's just going to be crazy.
Yeah, it seems like a good idea at the time. Oh, I can balance this out. And then no, it's not going to work that way.
Right. If you find yourself turning to payday loans are incredibly predatory. I am astonished that we don't have laws against the payday loans and the incredible interest rates that they charge. You're not, if you're using payday loans regularly, you are solidly in the debt cycle. And the debt cycle in general, if you find yourself having to turn to credit cards every month because you no longer have enough income to pay your basic living expenses, that's another indication that, hey, I've got a problem here and I don't think I can just claw my way out. We all kind of have these defense mechanisms that we use to deal with the stress that all of this debt problem causes. And one of the biggest that I've found, and it's kind of, people laugh when they hear it, but I think it's absolutely legitimate, is one of the biggest coping mechanisms we have is to ignore the problem. Right. If you're not opening mail because you're scared of what you might find in there, you probably want to pick up the phone or go to a website. You want to schedule a free consultation. If you're getting closer and closer to retirement and you haven't been able to put anything aside to save for retirement because all of your money goes out the door towards the credit cards, let me tell you, Social Security is not designed to be your only retirement source. Social Security is the bare minimum. So if you've been putting off saving for retirement and you're only a couple decades away from hopefully retiring, you want to get this debt situation figured out. A couple of years ago, I was listening to a program, and it was a news program, and they were talking to a young couple who the wife had worked for a debt settlement company. So she kind of knew the ins and outs of these debt management plans and kind of knew the levers to pull and negotiate these things. And so basically what they did, the whole program was, they were so proud because they had paid off like some incredible amount, like $180,000 of debt. They had just, including student loans, it was an incredible amount. Yeah. They were a young family, recently married. They had like 3 young children, all like, young grade school, toddler age. And, the whole story was about, hey, we did it. We, worked really hard. And they were talking about how the husband would work basically 3 jobs. He worked a full-time job and 2 part-time jobs. And they were talking about how to save money on living expenses, he would actually drive from his full-time job when he was done to the parking lot of his first part-time job and sleep in his car in the parking lot. So he didn't have to go home and pay extra electricity and all that stuff and pack all their lunches and all those things. And, he did that for like a period of 5 or 6 years in order to generate all that extra income.
That's a long time.
And the whole story was this, kind of like heartwarming piece about like, wow, we did it. And the only thing I could think of was, what about the unexpected costs you're not talking about? Those kids during that 5 to 6 year period barely ever saw their father because he was working 80, 90 hours a week, just, crazy, working all the time to make the banks even richer. But what did their family lose? They didn't talk about that at all. And that's real. I mean, when people come in to meet with me, a lot of them have been struggling with this debt for so long, it's stressful. And, sleepless nights. I don't want to open the mailbox. My spouse and I are fighting about this all the time. And one of the benefits that this has for people is I can breathe. Like, I know this is under control. I see light at the end of the tunnel. I know this is going to work. I don't have to worry about, oh my gosh, I'm going to get sued. I'm going to get garnished. I'm going to get foreclosed on. I don't know how I'm going to pay this bill. I'm juggling all these different payments. We're, 3 months behind on the light bill, or the light's going to get cut off. All those kinds of things. If you find yourself struggling with these thoughts and these emotions, come in for a free consultation. It's absolutely free. And, one of the things I commonly hear from clients is, man, I should have talked to you months ago.
Yeah.
I should have been here 6 months, 12 months, 18 months ago, because I was so scared about what bankruptcy is and what I thought it was going to be and how it was going to just ruin my life. I just avoided it. And then I started getting garnished and I couldn't avoid it anymore. And, if you find yourself in those positions, it costs nothing to learn about what your rights are.
Great advice as always, Michael. Well, thanks for tuning in to Debt Cycle, gaining your financial freedom from credit cards with experienced attorney Michael Sheridan. To connect with Mike, head to atlasbankruptcy.com and please be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. Thanks so much for being here, Mike. I always appreciate all your insight.
My pleasure, Kevin.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.